Um, okay, welcome everyone to the Cartographer weekly community meeting. Um, Today is January still 19, and I will start sharing my screen right now. And there you go. I'm not the kind of host who will ask you if you're watching my screen because I know you're seeing my screen. There you go. So welcome. Remember that we have an open agenda, and the goal so far for this space has been to provide updates from the project to the community out there of users and adopters. And you know, it's also an open space to bring questions here. Feel free to add yourself to the attendees list. And welcome if we have new faces here. Uh, Not much, but welcome Cora, Milan, and all the maintainers team. It's great to have you here. So if we go to the TLDR, the goal of this short section again is to have a grasp on what's new in the project. This week, there's been documentation work being done by Rashid and some other team members. Documentation is proving to be really hard, and it's a never-ending task. So I don't know if you all wanted to comment on the new CRD docs.
They haven't landed yet. I'm waiting for a PR on it, but we now have explain working the way it ought
I'm
to.
assuming you can hear me, right?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you both.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very Zoom moment. Yeah, there's now one source of truth for documentation in the definition of how our CRDs are structured and the spec for them. That one source of truth comes with some, yeah, Ikora, yeah, but it comes with some annoying caveats. Hurts the perfectionist in me, such as explain just slams all new lines together. So just it's a thing that it does, and in fact, even like pod explain pod suffers from the same problem. So even the Kubernetes teams suffer from that kind of thing. And then we have sort of like a similar issue in then trying to present that as the CRD spec. If you actually jump straight to that preview that you're looking at right now, just browse the preview. It's sort of where the sunglasses smiley faces on your screen there.
Yep. Yeah, sorry, I lost audio for a couple of seconds. So
that's all right. If you click on that,
to see the preview, maybe, right?
Yep. And then documentation, and then development version. Mm-hmm. And then when you go to the CR reference.
Oh, that's great.
We've got like under maybe workload.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is now generated from documentation. I just noticed a problem. Other than the fact that it just slams the copyright up there, even though that's something we don't really want to have in the docs. This is all now built from what we document. So it's imperfect because sometimes you want to put annotations, but you'll just have to put those afterwards. But this is all automatically generated now from the same documentation that creates explain. So that's the work that presents.
This is awesome. So it makes it, more, I don't know if easy is the word, but more scalable to maintain for future releases. Is that correct?
More likely to be maintained consistently. Yeah.
Okay.
Because we're human and we're going to miss something. Yeah. So, yeah. And also, it's much more obvious where you need to drop your docs as you're modifying the CR spec, right? It's more obvious that in your actual CR definitions of the objects in Go, that you're supposed to add some new comments when something changes. in line rather than go searching the docs for where you should be putting it.
Great. Thank you. That's awesome. Let me put the link here in the notes real quick. Yeah, but that's great. Okay. Anything else to summarize what's new in the project this week?
Garbage collecting of stamped objects still continues, just putting in some guardrails there to make sure users don't get themselves into some unfortunate situations. I think we built out the feature and just had on a bit of reflection, realized that they could specify only keeping 0 successful or failed runnable objects around, which would mean that we'd garbage collect everything and we'd lose output, which wouldn't be good. But I think that should come in, and this should be closing out this week.
Okay, cool. That's great. Let me put it here. Okay. There you go. That's great. Thanks. And well, now what team is working on? Again, garbage collecting stamped objects, and yeah, work around RFCs, a couple of RFCs. Any comment around this?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of design right now. So we continue on updating RFC 18 for tracking artifacts in the workload status. We hit a bit of a snag on this one. I don't know if Rashuma, you want to get into the details of that, or I can briefly touch on it, whatever you want.
Yeah, I would just say that there are some CRDs that report the latest successful artifact. Examples would be KPAC and our own runnable. And it's not, neither of those artifacts, neither of those status messages let you know what was the spec generation, what was the shape of the spec that led to this latest successful output. And because of that, we can't associate this input led to that output. The way forward is either one, get the authors of those CRDs to provide more information so that that is something that we can track, or two, at least in those two examples that we have, the CRD is generating other objects on the cluster that would have more information. So for example, KPAC creates builds, and each of those builds has information about what generation, et cetera, had caused that build. So yeah, there's just some exploration to be done there to figure out what's the best way forward.
Does KPAC not support observed generation properly in the image CRD? Or is that something they could be asked to do?
I would argue that they are using observed generation properly, because what they you submit a new definition of the object to the cluster. You submit that object is submitted to the cluster. Like they reconcile on it and they say like, hey, I'm processing something, and that's the observed generation, right? But they're still outputting some information about, well, the most recent good image is this one. And observed generation, I don't think is meant to say like, what is the most recent good thing? It's meant to say I'm looking at the status. Does the status represent the most recent thing you know about this spec that is generation X? And I would argue that yes, that is what they are telling us, that you submitted generation X, and I've reconciled on generation X, and I'm telling you the most up-to-date information that I know about generation X.
Wouldn't they update a condition in the status to say something is incomplete before bumping observed generation? Or are they bumping observed generation and then leaving the status at ready with, you know, something
So
from a previous thing?
The status goes to unknown because they're processing something, but that's somewhat orthogonal to the latest image. The conditions, I would say, are in sync with the observed generation, which is also in sync with the spec. It's latest image that's out of sync, and by design, latest image is not necessarily meant to be here's the output of this spec. It's just like it's the most recent good thing that we've seen.
If you wait for, I'm not saying I don't believe you, I just want to understand. If you wait for observed generation to change and the condition to say, you know, ready, true, and then you pull latest image, what's the situation where that doesn't reflect the latest image?
That would be fine, but you would risk locking up your cluster in two ways. One, let's say that you had some bad source code come down the line that can't build until a new update comes through. Everything past that point in KPAC in your supply chain would go blank because KPAC wouldn't be outputting an artifact anymore because status is not true. The other thing is if you have commits coming in, let's say it takes an hour to build, you've got a really large project and you're working on inner loop, so you've got changes coming on the scale of minutes. In a similar way, KPAC would just always be building, and it would stay in an unknown state for status, and you would never be able to read latest image, and so the rest of your supply chain would be broken.
If we're just using it for provenance, just using it to create that artifact graph, right, and not for promoting things, does that change anything?
It would. I mean, it means that your supply chain is no longer broken, but you would like those two. What you would end up with is in those two scenarios, rather than you have a supply chain that's broken, you would end up with in those two scenarios you can't determine provenance.
So a key problem here is two updates in a row, right, to the spec, or like an update to the spec while it's processing, leaves it in the processing state between generations of the image. So you never get to status ready in the conditions. Okay, I think
it's edge. That's edge triggered. You're describing moving to edge triggering. Now, if the artifact that is picked up by the next resource is level triggered, but we prove provenance for that object by level triggering, we're still stuck.
Yep, that makes sense. I just wanted to understand the sequence.
Okay, that's great. Okay, and also regarding best practices for multiple supply chains.
Yeah, so this is the other thing we're diving into. RFC 9 is one such example of how we've been thinking about approaching multiple supply chains. There's lots of interesting bits in there. Ushuma, this is also you. I don't know if you want to go into details there.
Yeah. So yeah, right now, platforms have to deal with workloads that have lots of different shapes and needs, and we can right now we enable those platforms by saying you can have an unbound number of supply chains, and you can use selectors to determine which supply chain should apply to a given workload based on the labels on that workload. RFC9 looks for ways forward that would reduce the number of supply chains necessary by, for example, saying rather than selecting on whole supply chains, or not instead of, but along with being able to select for a whole supply chain, you could also come to an individual step or an individual resource in a supply chain and say, there are 3 different templates here, and based on some criteria, you'll decide to deploy one of these templates rather than the other templates. We could simply stick with selectors, label selectors, or we could say let's make it a little bit richer. Let's any information that's in the templating context at that point could be used for making such a conditional decision. Yeah, I'll say I'm a fan of the second. The RFC touches on some options on either one. So, for example, even if we were to stick with just using labels, we could have mutating webhooks that would inspect the workload and apply labels automatically, so that we could reduce the burden on app devs to decorate with all the labels. I would say what's on the screen right now is, as you can see, this conversation from, it's actually even from before September 7th. This is all stuff that was ported over when we moved to this Cartographer repo. There's been a rewrite to RFC9, so that in part based on all the feedback here. Yeah, so so yeah, I would say ultimately, if we think, and my gut is that there would be consensus on the need to reduce the number of supply chains that are necessary to be maintained, which would require resource level selection. Then the question becomes, okay, do we do that using just labels, or do we do that using something a little richer? I think that's the big decision point that we should gather feedback on.
Yeah, sorry. Using labels and selectors, and what will be another approach?
Along with, so using any information available in the templating context. So what does that mean? That means, one, anything in the template spec could be used. I've heard some people refer to that as field selectors, but so that also available in the template spec is the artifacts that have come off of earlier resources in the supply chain. I suspect that there will be some steps in a supply chain that could produce an output that would then change what later objects in a supply chain would want to do. The most concrete example I could give is, let's say that you have some source code, you put it into the supply chain, and the convention service decorates your deployment with some information, and then that makes it possible or impossible for Knative to deploy that code. That's not something that could be known by just examining the fields on the workload when the workload is submitted. You would have to wait until the convention service did that decoration. If we, and because of that, label selectors wouldn't be sufficient, because label selectors would be applied at the time that the workload is submitted. Instead, we would want to have that whole templating context available for the conditional, to be able to examine what's all the information about what's happened so far in the supply chain to decide which template are we going to use, this Knative one or a different one.
In that case, would you be switching on the, like, because the supply chain is usually used to generate configuration, not like deploy a Knative service immediately, right? Would it really make sense to switch on the resource that gets generated versus having, kind of what we do now, where it's inside of a template where the thing that gets generated is determined?
Do you mean using YTT or?
Right.
Yeah, so I guess a goal that I have that wasn't explicit in that convo is to remove all conditional YTT from templates. I think of that as a code smell and as a complication that makes it more difficult for one. I think I've seen users come in and say like, oh, well, there are these examples in the open source Cartographer, but when I look at the supply chains that have actually been handed to me by the platform that I'm on, they're full of YTT, right? And that would be one reason that I think it's really valuable to remove that YTT, to simplify those templates, and to put the conditional logic in a place that's a little clearer.
That makes a lot of sense. If you put the conditional, if you make the conditional dynamic and based on the resources that are flowing through, that kind of changes the infrastructure that gets generated over time, right? So like at one point, the supply chain is this set of persistent resources, and then later it's this other set, and then maybe it switches back. Is that, or maybe you generate both all the time and you're just promoting between the two? Have you thought about what that, how that graph changes, or what, like the implications of, like, would you always generate all of them? Would you just generate them the first, I guess, on the first branch through or something, but then keep the old ones around? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I hadn't thought about what happens to the objects that, like, if you change from, if it at step N, if you change from template A to template B, presumably the most recent object for template A would still be in the supply chain, or not, still be in the cluster. I'd expect that you could garbage collect it at that point, but I haven't thought about like what would be the dangers of the corner cases there. It's a good
that, I mean, my first obvious one there, this is what I was going to put my hand up for the same reason, Stephen, that I understand where you're coming from with that idea with Schumer, but my concern is like you leave a KPAC down and it builds another image, it's still producing output, but it's no longer selected for in the supply chain that's been dynamically created. It's that kind of, I mean, KPAC, yeah, with the builders. I think if we can assert that for a particular workload, you have a particular shape, which means not being based on the template context, but only on the workload, that's a much safer, saner but not necessarily flexible enough solution. But we should start with the safe and sane and worry about those edge cases. See if we can worry about them some other way that keeps everything more easy to reason about.
I don't, into that, I don't have start simple, makes total sense to me. I think that I'm curious. I think that the danger that you're pointing out, which, the problems that you're pointing out make sense. But I think that they are inherent in that use case that I was putting forward. That, it may be that at some point steps in the supply chain start to invalidate later steps conditionally, if that makes sense. So yeah, and it's just a question of like, do we live in that world or not? Do we have users that will have that need or not? Until we know that we do, like, let's do something safe and simple, is totally reasonable approach.
Yeah, Joshua,
Sorry, Josh,
please.
you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my ideas have already been addressed by others, but yeah, I just want to point out that these are two very different like questions we're raising, right? It's like, one, do we want this dynamic nature in the templating at all? And then like, do we want to be able to switch templates based on something static, like the label or some property in the workload? And then the other one is like, do we want this to be dynamic based on other artifacts in the supply chain? And I just want to call it that we should reason about those separately. Marty?
I also just wanted to point out, do we not right now have the problem of the garbage collection already? Like, if a different supply chain gets selected because a new one comes in that matches better, anything that was stamped out by the original one is going to stick around forever.
I think that is correct.
Yeah, I think that's correct, but I think it's much easier if it's not a dynamic supply chain to make a decision to remove the old one because a new one got selected, right?
Yeah, I agree, but I think I'm just pointing out that these are problems that we have to solve to some degree, either way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I didn't necessarily want to do the dynamic selection, but like, yeah, the problems are not ones that we don't have to address anyway.
I mean, I don't think it's garbage collection that has me concerned so much as the simplicity of read. Like, it's already a complex system. We're trying to find ways to make it easier to understand, easier to modify. I think I put that above those criteria personally.
Yeah, definitely hear that. Just wanted to call it out.
Just before you go, Stephen, I just want to mention I've put in an item for the fact that we're doing a hack day on Friday, where we would like very much to just slam some ideas and present them on better, basically a way to try to move away from if this then that, wherever we can, including all of these things that Washim has brought up.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, for sure. Actually, I had a question about the label. So putting the dynamic generation aside for a second and thinking about if you're just going to use labels to determine which resources get generated statically when the workload's created, is that going to make connecting the inputs and outputs together like kind of hard to see? Because if you connected something that was mislabeled, you'd be pointing to an input that didn't exist in some instantiation of it.
I think like in our artifact graph, right, they're always tied back to the resource that created them under the hood. And so as things are flowing through the pipeline, through the supply chain, right, you you would always still be able to trace back that graph, because you may, like, even though there may be like certain other items in the supply chain that didn't get stamped out, like the artifact still has to come from an individual object.
I'm saying, maybe I'm misinterpreting RFC 9, but in the RFC, it seems like in the template refs, like depending on the state of the workload, or depending on the labels in the workload, different, are you saying that they have to be in the same shape and always have the same outputs if different labels get selected and inputs?
Not necessarily. I don't think the supply chain has to be in the same shape, but I do think that your upstream, like, yes, your upstream artifacts still need to fulfill downstream contracts, right? So if I'm a downstream template that relies on an upstream, say, image, that image still needs to exist.
And if you depend on an upstream image, but a different version, a different labeled version, right, doesn't depend on it, then you could end up with an upstream thing that's happening for no reason, right? Because it's not actually fed into what the graph ends up looking like for your workload. I think I'm not complaining about like a problem with it, just a user interface thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like we should think about we should make sure this is easy for a supply chain author to reason about what's going to get the infrastructure that's going to get generated to match their workload. But I think I like the idea because it keeps it very simple. I'm just trying to think through all the different edge cases, or it's more simple than, making things conditional on the parameters, or, especially I think dynamically would get really hard to think about. But I want to make sure that it's not hard for a supply chain author to reason about what gets generated in the different cases. But I think it's manageable as long as they're all in the same shape. But there's some things to think about, like, not accidentally creating meaningless things, if that makes sense, based on your inputs.
Yeah. So like one example I can think of, right, is you might have a supply chain that defines kind of like two paths, right? One starts with source, it builds an image and then passes that image on. And then another kind of branch in that supply chain, something that just, comes with a pre-built image, right? And so I think you're saying that just make sure we don't come up with like a Git source that does nothing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so yeah. So to me, in that case, it would skip kind of like those first two templates because it doesn't match on them. It would go straight to the image source template, so that it would just like to start discovering from there, and then those artifacts would be fed forward. But yeah, user interface problems for sure.
I think this adds a guideline to
me.
Sorry, Washima.
Okay, I'm surprised to hear an approach that assumes that right now it is still the case that if step n in a supply chain can't be stamped out, step n+1 will not be stamped, will not even be attempted. So to achieve what you were talking about, Josh, where there's a where you could have a resource that says like, oh, does it have label 1? No. Does it have label 2? No. Does it have label 3? No. Okay, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to go to the following step. Would be a change to the supply chain. Those are what I wanted to point out.
That's only like an underlying detail, though, right? It's something we never got around to making sure that they all operate, no matter what. Right. There was an issue at one point to go and make it so that they always got stamped if there was available inputs. Yeah, this is my point. That's what I was going to say to that.
Undoubtedly, I think the idea that you would use the conditionals to say I had assumed that if you define 3 conditions on a step and none of them match, that the that would be taken as an error condition, not as a maybe this is expected user behavior.
That's what my comment was going to be to Stephen's point. Like during the hack day, I've got a bunch of ideas in my head of what criteria I'd like to be able to meet. And I think one of the criteria I'd like to be able to meet is the ability for a supply chain author to have defined and declared the state of their supply chain such that they can tell if it's unsolvable, if there's a way that the selectors that are required to select paths through the supply chain results in an unsolvable, so that they are made aware that, you know, if someone doesn't supply this or does supply this, you'll end up in a place where it never ends, well before they even have to supply a workload to test it, right? So that's going to be one of my criteria to see if we can't fulfill that. That would be quite awesome. Whether or not it's possible, it's another thing, but that's it's a good point. It's a valuable point, because it'd be nice to be able to say, like, to have a strong type check, all right, on your supply chain. Assuming your template is something that takes an input and an output, you know, a set of inputs and an output successfully, does the declaration of your supply chain result in those all connecting based on the different variables you could provide? That would be quite neat. Not sure if it's possible, but it'd be awesome.
I think as long as you allow, or as long as you say that you have to, and like for a given step, right? This step always results in something that looks the same, regardless of what labels happen, right? Then you get a strong guarantee that you're always going to get a functional supply chain. Be interesting if you could say, well, you don't have to, as long as the graph is solvable or something like that.
It makes me feel like you need nested templates, right? That's going to be the interesting thing, because some things need to be replaced with multiple steps. So, and that's why I want to do a hack day, because yeah,
that makes sense.
We could talk forever, or we could demonstrate some of these ideas.
I think we have an RFC about this too. We kind of have an RFC around that too, supply chain snippets, right? That's kind of the idea of like grouping together sections, and then making those sections swappable.
You kind of embedded snippets or something. That's a way to.
Or like, yeah, you have like two build snippets, right? One is a Git source and an image builder, and then the other snippet is just the image source, and then those are interchangeable.
Mm-hmm. As long as they have the same inputs and output requirements, right? I think one of the struggles we have at the moment is our templates don't clearly declare what their input requirements are. We could ensure that we know what their input requirements are if we could abandon a YTT, all right? Because YTT makes it very hard for us to be decisive about what inputs we used, whereas our templates make it possible for us to be decisive about what inputs to spec.
Please.
Yeah, actually, the whole conversation just now is what I was going to talk about. Was you know, should we specify that when you in the RFC, I say like template refs, and then it it specifies each as a list, specifies each ref in the same manner, but it's like, I was thinking maybe we should say template refs, but we declare these are all image template refs, and there's an error if they are not. Essentially, as an implementation step for the same, along the same lines as what Stephen was thinking. One thing that would become interesting then is, do we declare upfront what the type is for each snippet? Yeah.
I think there's about 10 million small decisions we need to make for this. And they're all sort of related and sort of not related at the same time. So lots more thinking to do in this area.
Right, and as you may see, RFCs always trigger really interesting discussions. So interesting that they have their own space on all these hours. So yeah, so far it's great. If we need to continue this, just feel free to add it to the office hours agenda. For now, we need to move on. We just have less than 15 minutes for this meeting. Okay, thank you all. Follow up from previous meeting. Well, on previous meeting, if you remember, we had members from the OSS supply chain team from VMware, and they also request to have a demo, to have someone walk them through, really introductory level, how Cartographer works, what's the overall story on using it. And I've been kind of collecting the similar requests from even from the beginning in the introductory blog post. When Cartographer was announced, the idea was to have a demo recorded there, and it's an outstanding request so far. And there has been some other teams also asking for this. So I was wondering if we could solve all of that in one single space. If someone would like to volunteer, sorry, to have a demo here in the community meeting, it will be recorded, and I will be able to extract that and use it as a enablement resource to put it in the website and also in the YouTube channel. One-on-one demo intro to Cartographer. So I don't know, what do you think? And
are you looking only for like the developers on the team or anybody?
Anyone here?
I would love to, like, I'm working on a demo, but I don't know that it's like exactly what the development team would want to show. So if somebody's on the team is willing to like take a look at what I have first, I'm happy to use that if you want, if it helps. And then of course you can always say that's not what we want on YouTube. You didn't
awesome.
get it.
Thank you, Cora. Thank you. I don't know if Washuma has any comment on that.
Yeah, I was just going to point out, Rash and I are scheduled to do TGIK in mid-February. So it's like, oh, maybe we should get our act together and figure out what that's going to look like. And then our practice run could be. No, Rash, if you're anything, or I won't stop about scaring you, but I need to be scared so that I get the fire under my pants to get going.
Yeah.
I had committed to a history sort of leading into why Cartographer. So I hope you know I'm not going to. I haven't put my hand up for demoing at this point. Maybe Cora can help with that.
Yeah, it looks like we could again work, tag team with Cora and Wishuma to produce this demo. It could be helpful for Cora and also for the engagements we already have with TGIK and in general. So if you don't mind, I will out you both, and I will coordinate with you when you feel ready to do this here. And I think it will be useful. I will make sure that things that have requested demo will be here the day, that session, so they can provide comments. Thank you. Great. Open my discussion. Well, so far there's only one point there. If you need something, please drop it there. But yeah, I was thinking, considering, watching what other OSS projects are there, how they're handling community meetings, what's the overall theme and the overall goals for that kind of meeting. I've seen a pattern on having a space for issue triage or user story grooming, revision, you may call it. And I was wondering if we could make it a part of the community meetings. So in the future, users out there could have a vote or could have visibility into the decisions of what kind of user story to review before committing to iteration to a release. So I wanted to grab your thoughts around that.
I think my first thought is we're going through a lot of roadmap discussions right now. And they take more than half an hour. Yeah, I think the suggestion like, hey, we're an open source project. The roadmap should be open makes total sense. We should be able to take community feedback makes total sense. And then there are a number of everybody who's maintainer on the project right now happens to also work for the same company and have a lot of time that we spend together. So yeah, I don't think that we could do a one-for-one swap of that and have all the time that we do there in the open. I don't imagine there's any community member that would want to come to all of those meetings.
Do you have an IPM or like a planning meeting that's a closed meeting for Cartographer?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pre-IPM on the calendar, a weekly pre-IPM, a weekly IPM that are both on the calendar. We don't always hit both of them. And then we also have this week we've had multiple meetings about just a roadmap for the next month out.
Yeah, I was wondering about probably the pre-IPM, and probably I'm wrong, but I don't know if the goal of pre-IPM is exactly to review user stories before planning the actual iteration or the actual release. So not exactly a roadmap, weekly roadmap discussion, because that would be just too much. Just something similar to a pre-IPM.
Is there a reason we don't just open the meetings that we're having if we're just working on open source and it's, you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure if in that meetings right now there are some proprietary stuff that we cannot discuss there. There are some issues related with the commercial distribution. I'm not sure.
I think that, you know, the team isn't focusing on commercial things, right? Kind of moving forward. So unless something's changed in the month I've been gone, it seems like maybe it'd be possible to open more of that up.
What's our goal? Is it just to give community members a say in our roadmap and our priority and stuff like that? Or is it to surface that information, or?
Yeah, first thing, I'm trying to level set on what are what is the design for a community meeting. It's a space for users to bring questions, it's space for maintainers to give status updates, and also it usually have a space for issue triaging, issue revision before committing to a new iteration. So I'm aware that right now the Cartographer team does weekly user story revision before IPMs. So I was wondering if that previous revision could be a part now of the community meeting. It's useful because it could reduce one meeting. It could condense both things in a single meeting. And also it will provide visibility for users out there on the decision process.
I mean, yeah, I'm personally fine with opening up our IPM. I was just like, yeah, if people want to attend, yeah, I have no problem with that. It was just like I guess my point was that the output of our IPM, right, is our issue board, and that's already publicly visible. But if people just want to be involved in that process, then sure.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Anything else you would like to comment, discuss? No. Okay. Again, thanks so much for your time, and see you next week. Have a nice day.